The soft clinking of ice in a crystal glass was the only sound Arthur Sterling allowed himself to make. He sat alone in a secluded alcove at Aria, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a single, perfectly polished brass handle on an anonymous mahogany door. To the other patrons, shimmering in couture and murmuring about mergers and Monaco, he was just another severe-looking man in a flawlessly tailored Brioni suit, his silver hair a stark contrast to the dark wood panelling. They wouldn't know the watch on his wrist, a vintage Audemars Piguet, was a one-of-a-kind piece that had belonged to a deposed king. They wouldn't know that Arthur Sterling didn't just own companies. He consumed them, digested them, and added their assets to the colossal, ever-expanding organism that was Sterling Holdings. He despised these dinners. He came to Aria on the third Thursday of every month, a penance he'd set for himself after his wife, Eleanor, had passed. She had loved this place, not for its opulence, but for what she called its theatre. She saw the ballet of the servers, the narrative in a perfectly plated dish, the quiet drama in the eyes of the couple celebrating an anniversary in the corner. To Arthur, it was just a series of overpriced, inefficient transactions. But here he sat, staring at an untouched plate of seared scallops, the cavernous ache in his chest a familiar companion that no acquisition could ever fill. He was profoundly, existentially bored with the deferential whispers of his board members, the predictable praise from financial analysts, the sterile, climate-controlled perfection of the world he had meticulously constructed. His gaze, usually sharp enough to dissect a balance sheet from across a room, swept over the other diners with the detached analysis of a biologist observing a foreign species. A tech mogul trying too hard to impress his date, a political donor, and his unnervingly young wife. A family whose inherited wealth was evident in their casual disdain for their surroundings. They were all types, archetypes, utterly predictable. Then his eyes settled on a waitress. Her name tag read Clara. Her uniform, a simple, elegant black dress, was immaculate. She moved through the controlled chaos of the dining room with a liquid grace, a preternatural calm that set her apart from the other staff, who scurried with a barely concealed anxiety. There were faint, violet shadows of fatigue beneath her eyes, but her posture was perfect, her expression a mask of serene focus. She presented a wine bottle here, decrumbed a table there, her mind a silent, intricate database of information. Table 7's host is left-handed. The woman at Table 3 is allergic to shellfish, but her companion ordered the lobster bisque. Watch for cross-contamination. The man in the corner alcove hasn't touched his scallops. Check on him in exactly 3 minutes. Clara's world was a universe removed from Arthur's, yet they were both architects of meticulously controlled environments. Her life was a constant, desperate balancing act. The tuition for the art history degree she'd been forced to abandon, the mountain of debt her parents had been left with after a charismatic, financial advisor had vaporized their life savings. These were the demons that drove her through 16-hour days. Every perfectly folded napkin, every flawlessly recited special, was a small payment against a debt that felt infinite. She had been 1 semester away from completing her thesis on 17th century Dutch art forgery, her specialty the minute, almost imperceptible tells that betrayed a master's hand, or the hand of a master forger. Now she applied that same obsessive attention to detail, to the authenticity of a diner's smile, or the subtle tells of a guest about to complain. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. Arthur watched her, a flicker of professional interest piqued. It wasn't just her efficiency, it was her observation. He saw her notice a microscopic crack in a wine glass before she poured, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second. He saw her eyes briefly register the way a man at another table surreptitiously slipped his wedding ring into his pocket as his date went to the restroom. She saw everything. She didn't offer the cloying, manufactured friendliness of the other servers. Her smile was a rare, precise instrument, deployed only when genuine, like when she complimented an elderly woman's brooch. She had a stillness about her, a quiet dignity that was a fortress against the thankless, invisible nature of her work. He was about to dismiss her from his thoughts, to return to the cold reality of his scallops and the colder reality of his life, when the mahogany door swung open. It wasn't a guest. It was a violation. Two men, dressed in dark, practical clothing, their faces obscured by plain black balaclavas, entered with a horrifying silence. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They moved with the cold, practiced efficiency of professionals. One was broad-shouldered, the other wiry. The wiry one held a compact, matte black pistol, not waving it erratically, but holding it with a steady, two-handed grip, its muzzle sweeping the room in a calm, deliberate arc. The second man, the larger one, held a heavy canvas bag. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, unnervingly calm baritone that cut through the restaurant's hushed ambiance. "We will be taking your valuables. Please place your watches, rings, and wallets on the table. Do not make any sudden movements. Do not attempt to be a hero. We are professionals, and we would prefer not to be violent." The theatre of Aria shattered. A woman's gasp was swallowed by a wave of thick, terrified silence. The tech mogul's bravado evaporated, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the clasp of his Rolex. Fear, raw and primal, seeped into the perfumed air. Arthur Sterling's mind, a machine honed by decades of hostile takeovers and corporate warfare, instantly calculated the variables. Two assailants, calm, organized. One firearm, held with proficiency. Objective is high-value assets, not cash. Low probability of random violence. High probability of targeted violence if resisted. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the custom-made panic button concealed in the seam of his trousers, a direct line to his private security team, a small army that could be there in minutes. But he stopped. His eyes were on Clara. She had been en route to the kitchen, a tray laden with dirty dishes balanced on one hand. She was caught in the open, directly in the path of the wiry gunman as he began to move from table to table. She did not scream. She did not drop the tray. She did not freeze. With a slowness that was mesmerizing, she turned and placed the tray on a nearby service stand. The sound of porcelain settling on linen was the only sound in the room. Then she straightened up, her hands held loosely at her sides, palms slightly open, in a universal gesture of non-aggression. "Okay," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the silent room with absolute clarity. It was the same serene, focused voice she used to describe the wine list. "Everyone, please do as they ask. It's just property. It can all be replaced." Her eyes met the gunman's, or rather, the two dark holes in his mask. It wasn't a challenge. It was a communication, a moment of de-escalation. Her gaze held no fear. Instead, it was one of intense, almost academic, observation. Arthur, a master at reading people, saw it clearly. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was analyzing a threat, noting his stance, the brand of his tactical boots, the way he distributed his weight. An elderly man at a nearby table began to have a panic attack, his breathing ragged and loud. The gunman's head snapped toward the sound, the first sign of agitation breaking through his professional calm. "Keep him quiet," he hissed. "Sir," Clara said, her voice a calm anchor in the rising sea of panic. She took a single, deliberate step toward the man's table. The gunman's weapon tracked her movement. "Sir, look at me. My name is Clara. I need you to breathe with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. You're doing perfectly." She was managing the room. She was managing the collateral damage. The broad-shouldered man was now at the tech mogul's table, efficiently scooping jewelry and wallets into his bag. As he reached for a woman's diamond necklace, the clasp caught. He tugged impatiently. "Allow me," Clara said, her voice still impossibly calm. She moved to the table. The gunman tensed, but she ignored him, her focus entirely on the panicked woman. "It's a pressure clasp," she explained softly, as if teaching a new employee. "You have to push in and twist." Her fingers moved with deft precision, and the necklace came free. She placed it gently on the table for the robber to collect. It was an act of such audacious, surreal composure that it seemed to momentarily stun even the robbers. She wasn't a victim. She was, in some bizarre way, facilitating the process to ensure its smooth and safe completion. As the broad-shouldered man moved on, Clara's eyes flickered down to the bag. For a split second, Arthur saw her focus on the man's wrist, where a small, intricate tattoo of a coiled serpent was visible between his glove and his sleeve. She filed it away. He was certain of it. The robbers were efficient. Within 3 minutes, they had what they came for. "We're leaving now," the calm voice announced. No one moved for 5 minutes. They backed out of the mahogany door and vanished into the night. For a moment, the room remained frozen in a tableau of shock. Then, it fractured. Sobs broke the silence. A man cursed loudly. The manager rushed to the phone, his hands shaking. And through it all, Clara moved. She went first to the elderly man, getting him a glass of water and speaking to him in low, reassuring tones. She checked on the woman whose necklace she had unclasped. She moved from table to table, a singular point of calm in the chaotic aftermath. Arthur Sterling sat in his alcove, his hand long since retreated from his panic button. He hadn't moved. He had witnessed the entire event, not as a potential victim, but as a connoisseur of rare talent. He had seen titans of industry break down and weep over a percentage point drop in the stock market. He had watched politicians crumble under the mildest of press scrutiny. This young woman, earning a pittance to serve him overpriced scallops, had faced a loaded gun with more tactical grace and psychological acuity than anyone he had ever employed. It wasn't bravery in the foolish, cinematic sense. It was control. She had assessed the threat, identified the variables, the panic of the patrons, the impatience of the robbers, and systematically managed them to mitigate risk. It was the single most extraordinary display of crisis management he had ever witnessed. The police arrived, their sirens a jarring intrusion into the rarefied air of Aria. Statements were taken. The controlled chaos of the restaurant was replaced by the procedural chaos of a crime scene. Clara, her face now pale under the fluorescent lights of the investigators, her composure finally showing the smallest of cracks, eventually brought the check to Arthur's table. The restaurant manager had already declared everything was on the house, but she did it anyway, a creature of habit and procedure. Her hand trembled, just slightly, as she placed the leather billfold on the table. "I am so terribly sorry for the disruption, sir," she said, her voice a little hoarse. Arthur looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the frayed edges of a life lived on the brink, the profound exhaustion, and the core of unannealed steel that lay beneath it all. He opened the billfold. Inside, he placed not his credit card, but 10 $1,000 bills, a crisp, thick stack from the emergency cash he always carried. Beneath the top bill, he tucked his personal business card, a stark, heavyweight piece of cardstock with nothing but his name and a private number engraved in black ink. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the table. "That wasn't composure," he said, his voice a low rumble that was for her alone. "That was a masterclass. You don't just see, you observe. A very rare, very valuable commodity." Before the stunned Clara could form a response, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a sum of money that could temporarily halt her drowning and a small black card that held the power to either pull her from the water for good or drag her down into depths she couldn't possibly imagine. The next few days passed in a surreal haze for Clara. The $10,000 felt like a fiction, a stack of paper props from a play. She stared at it on her small kitchen table, the crisp faces of dead presidents, a stark contrast to the pile of red-stamped overdue bills beside them. The money was a powerful anesthetic, numbing the immediate gnawing pain of her family's debt. She paid off the highest interest credit card, sent her parents enough to cover their mortgage for 3 months, and even bought a new set of tires for her aging Honda. It was a breath of oxygen, but she knew the water was still rising. The business card, however, was a different matter. It sat beside the money, a small black rectangle of pure potential and pure terror. Arthur Sterling. She didn't need to look him up, but she did anyway, falling down a rabbit hole of articles in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and The Economist. The Vulture of Wall Street, the man who buys ghosts, the reclusive kingmaker. The stories painted a portrait of a man of monastic discipline and surgical ruthlessness, a corporate predator who operated with the emotional detachment of a shark. And then she found the other stories, the more personal ones. They spoke of his late wife, Eleanor Vance Sterling, a brilliant and beloved philanthropist and art collector. They spoke of the great tragedy that had clouded her final years, the Vance collection scandal, where it was discovered that nearly a third of the modern art she had acquired for the Sterling Foundation was, in fact, exquisitely crafted forgeries. The scandal had shattered her. The articles, filled with anonymous quotes, suggested she died of a broken heart, humiliated and betrayed by the world she loved. Arthur Sterling had retreated from public life shortly after, becoming the phantom who pulled the strings from the shadows of his eponymous tower. Clara held the card, the pieces clicking into place. You don't just see, you observe. He hadn't just been impressed by her calm. He had seen something else, something that resonated with his own personal tragedy. It made the offer, because it had to be an offer, infinitely more terrifying. This wasn't a whim. It was a calculated move by a man who never made a move without a reason. For a week, the card tormented her. Was this some bizarre game of a bored billionaire? Was he expecting something from her? Something beyond a simple thank you? The world she came from had taught her that nothing was free, and gifts of this magnitude always came with hidden clauses and suffocating expectations. You have to call, her mother said over the phone, her voice a mixture of hope and trepidation. Clara, a man like that doesn't do things by accident. What if this is the way out? The way out, the phrase echoed in her mind. A way out of the crushing debt, out of the endless shifts, out of the ghost life she was living, haunted by the ghost of the life she was supposed to have. Her pride, the stubborn remnant of her academic ambition, warred with the pragmatic desperation of her reality. Pride couldn't keep her parents in their home. On the 8th day, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, she dialed the number. She expected an assistant, a labyrinthine phone tree, a fortress of gatekeepers. A voice answered on the first ring. Sterling. It was him. The same deep, resonant voice from the restaurant, stripped of all pleasantries. It was a statement of fact, not a greeting. Clara's mouth went dry. "Mr. Sterling, this is Clara Rossi, from Aria." There was a pause, not of confusion but of evaluation. She could feel him analyzing her cadence, the slight tremor in her voice. "I know who you are, Ms. Rossi. I was beginning to doubt my assessment of you. 8 days is a lifetime in my world. It suggests indecision." The critique, so blunt and immediate, sparked a flicker of defiance in her. "In my world, Mr. Sterling, it's called due diligence. An unsolicited offer from a stranger of your reputation requires careful consideration." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, she could have sworn there was the barest hint of amusement in his tone. "Well played. Sterling Tower, 90th floor, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Do not be late." The line went dead. The next morning, Clara stood before a skyscraper that didn't seem to end, a shard of obsidian and steel that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. She wore the only interview-appropriate outfit she owned, a simple navy blue sheath dress and a blazer she'd bought on clearance 2 years ago. It felt like armor, but thin and brittle as she walked through the cavernous lobby, a cathedral of white marble and hushed power. The 90th floor was another world entirely. The air was different, thin and cool and silent. A severe-looking woman with a geometric haircut directed her not to an office, but to a private gallery. The walls were lined with masterpieces, a Rothko that seemed to vibrate with color, a small, intense Giacometti sculpture, a de Kooning that radiated chaotic energy. Arthur Sterling stood before a large, turbulent seascape by Turner, his back to her. "Eleanor loved this one," he said, his voice softer in the vast space. "She said he didn't paint water, he painted power. Most people just see a storm. She saw the mathematics of chaos." He turned, his eyes locking onto hers. They were a pale, piercing grey, and they held the unnerving stillness of a predator. "I don't believe in luck, Ms. Rossi. I believe in recognizing and acquiring valuable assets. In that restaurant, I saw an asset." "An asset?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "You possess a quality I have spent a lifetime and a fortune trying to cultivate in my executives. The ability to see what is actually there, stripped of emotion and expectation. You didn't see a robbery. You saw a tactical situation with a set of variables to be managed. You didn't see a victim. You saw a liability to be controlled. You didn't see a criminal. You saw a detail, the tattoo on his wrist." Clara froze. He had seen that? "Oh yes," he said, answering her unspoken question. "I saw you see it. Just as I saw you notice the fake Hermes bag at table 4 and the hairline fracture in the wine glass. Your attention to detail, to authenticity, is pathological. In your current profession, it is a charming but ultimately wasted talent. Here, it could be a weapon." He gestured for her to walk with him. "My wife built one of the world's finest collections of modern art for our foundation. After she died, I learned a significant portion of it was fake. Exquisite forgeries, good enough to fool the experts at Sotheby's and Christie's. It destroyed her legacy. It made a mockery of her passion. I have since purged the collection, but the rot, I suspect, goes deeper. The art world, like my own, is built on confidence and perception. It is rife with charlatans, liars and thieves who hide behind a veneer of sophistication." He stopped in front of a heavy door at the end of the gallery. "I have a problem, Miss Rossi. I am surrounded by experts who tell me what they think I want to hear. Their vision is clouded by reputation, by provenance, by the dollar value of a piece. They see the story, not the object. I need someone who sees the object, someone who sees the truth. He opened the door. It was a small, climate-controlled viewing room. On a single easel, bathed in a perfect, neutral light, was a painting. It was a portrait of a young woman, rendered in a style that was uncannily like an early Modigliani. "This piece was recently offered to the Foundation," Sterling said. "It's been authenticated by 3 separate experts. The provenance is impeccable, tracing it back to a private collection in Paris in the 1920s. My entire acquisitions committee, headed by a very ambitious young man named Julian Vance, is urging me to purchase it for a sum that would solve your family's financial problems for the rest of their lives. They all tell me it's genuine." He turned his full attention to her, his grey eyes like chips of ice. "I'm hiring you, Miss Rossi. Not as an employee, but as a consultant, reporting only to me. Your salary will be obscene. Your resources, unlimited. Your task is this: prove them wrong." Clara stared at the painting. It was her entire academic life, her abandoned thesis, her forgotten passion, all crystallized on a single canvas. This wasn't a job offer. It was a challenge. It was a test. And it was aimed at the one part of her she thought was dead and buried. "Why me?" she whispered. "Based on 10 minutes in a restaurant? I have made billion-dollar decisions in less time based on far less information," he said flatly. "The world is run by people who can make accurate assessments under pressure. You are one of them. The question is, are you willing to stake your future on it?" He gestured to the painting. "You have 1 week. Tell me the story that painting is really telling. Find the lie. Or prove it's real and I will find another use for your talents. But I don't think it's real. And I think you are the only person who can tell me why." He walked out, leaving her alone with the portrait of the young woman, the ghost of Modigliani, and the crushing, terrifying weight of the opportunity of a lifetime. Clara's first day was not spent in an office, but in the sterile viewing room, which became her sanctuary and her laboratory. Arthur Sterling was true to his word. Her access was absolute. A simple request produced archival records, high-resolution spectral imaging data, and detailed chemical analyses of the pigments. She was a ghost within the machine of Sterling Holdings, invisible to all but Arthur himself. The pressure was immense. She felt the ghost of her former self, the promising art history scholar, watching over her shoulder, judging her. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but look. She sat on a stool and simply observed the painting, letting her eyes absorb every detail. The elongated neck, the almond-shaped eyes, the melancholic tilt of the head. It was a masterful imitation. The style was perfect, the mood captured flawlessly. The experts had been right to be fooled. It felt like a Modigliani. But feelings were not facts. On the 3rd day, she began her assault on its authenticity. She dove into the provenance, the chain of ownership that was the bedrock of any artwork's value. The documents were pristine, tracing the painting from a Parisian gallery in 1922 through a series of private European collectors before landing in a Swiss vault. It was a perfect story. Too perfect. She cross-referenced the name of the first owner, a Monsieur Dubois, with Parisian gallery archives from the period. He existed. He was a known patron of the arts. But in the detailed sales ledgers, while Dubois had purchased several paintings in 1922, there was no record of a Modigliani. It was a small tear in a seamless narrative, but it was there. Next, she turned to the science. The pigment analysis report was dense, filled with chemical jargon, but Clara had spent a semester interning at a conservation lab. She knew what to look for. She scanned the results for titanium dioxide. The report showed trace amounts of the Anatase form, which was consistent with pigments from the early 20th century. But as she scrolled deeper into the supplementary data, she found something else, a minuscule, almost negligible spike of the rutile form. Rutyl titanium white wasn't commercially available as an artist's pigment until the early 1940s. Modigliani died in 1920. It was a microscopic, damning anachronism. A single grain of sand that proved the entire beach was artificial. Any competent analyst should have seen it. Why hadn't they? She pulled up the files on the external experts the Foundation had hired. They were all titans in their field. It was unlikely all three would miss it, which meant they hadn't been looking, or they had been encouraged not to. Her focus shifted from the painting to the man who was championing it. Julian Vance. Arthur had mentioned him by name. He was the head of the Foundation's acquisitions committee. Clara requested his file. It read like a blueprint for a modern corporate prince. Phillips Exeter, Yale, Harvard Business School. A rapid, flawless ascent up the corporate ladder. His photo showed a man with razor-sharp features, a smug, confident smile, and the cold eyes of someone who had never failed at anything. He was the gatekeeper. He had selected the experts. He had presented their findings to Arthur. He was the architect of the painting's story. To understand the artist, you had to understand his patron. Clara began to dig into Julian Vance. She used the full, terrifying power of the Sterling Holdings Research Department, a team of data miners who could unearth a person's kindergarten report card if asked. She requested all of Julian's internal communications and expense reports related to the Modigliani acquisition. The paper trail was clean, professional, but Clara wasn't looking for a smoking gun. She was looking for a tell, a subtle brush stroke that was out of place. She found it in his travel expenses. He had made 3 trips to Geneva to inspect the painting. On one of those trips, there was a dinner expensed at a ridiculously expensive restaurant for one person. But there was also a charge from a hotel bar, time-stamped an hour later, for 2 very specific, high-end cocktails. It was a tiny, sloppy mistake. A man dining alone doesn't usually follow up with a celebratory round of expensive drinks. He wasn't alone. Working on a hunch, she had the research team run a search for any known art dealers, restorers, or authenticators who were also in Geneva on that specific date. The search returned dozens of names. She started cross-referencing them against a list of individuals flagged in international art crime databases for dealing with forgeries. A name popped out: Jean-Luc Dubois. Not only was he a notorious, shadowy figure in the art world, whispered to be connected to some of the most sophisticated forgery rings in Europe, but his last name was the same as the painting's supposed first owner. It was a forger's inside joke, a brazen act of hubris. Julian Vance hadn't just been fooled, he was a willing participant. This wasn't a mistake. It was a conspiracy to defraud the Sterling Foundation of $50 million. But she still needed the final, irrefutable link. How did Julian benefit? A man like him didn't take a risk this huge for a simple kickback. She expanded her search, looking into his personal finances, his shell corporations, his offshore accounts. It was a digital fortress. Then she remembered the robbery at Aria, the cold, practiced efficiency, the tattoo of the coiled serpent. It had been nagging at her, an unsolved piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was assembling. On a wild, desperate whim, she requested the full, unredacted police report from the robbery, using Arthur Sterling's name to cut through the red tape. She scrolled through the witness descriptions, the inventory of stolen items, and then she saw it. Among the items taken from the tech mogul was a unique, custom-made briefcase. The report noted that the briefcase contained not just a laptop, but several encrypted hard drives. The mogul, a man named Marcus Thorne, was the CEO of a rival tech firm, that Sterling Holdings was rumored to be targeting for a hostile takeover. Her blood ran cold. The robbery hadn't been random. It was corporate espionage disguised as a common crime. It was too sophisticated, too targeted. Who would have the means and the motive? She returned to Julian Vance's file. Before heading the foundation, he had been a rising star in Sterling's mergers and acquisitions division. His specialty, hostile takeovers. His biggest rival within the company had been the executive leading the charge on the Marcus Thorne acquisition. If that deal were to fail, Julian would be the logical choice to take over. The pieces slammed together with the force of a physical impact. Julian was playing a much bigger game. The $50 million art fraud was just a means to an end. He needed a massive, untraceable slush fund to finance his own shadow operations, to hire criminals like the ones at Area, to sabotage his corporate rivals and clear his own path to the top. She now had the whole story. The lie wasn't just in the pigment of the painting. It was in the very fabric of the 90th floor. And Julian Vance was the weaver. She spent the next 24 hours compiling her findings into a presentation. It was a clinical, dispassionate demolition, built on facts and timelines, from the rutile titanium in the paint to the cocktails in Geneva, from the fake provenance to the real motive behind the Aria robbery. She included a high-resolution photo of the robber's tattooed wrist, next to a photo of the same tattoo on the known associate of Jean-Luc Dubois. Her week was up. She sent a single email to Arthur Sterling. "I'm ready." The meeting was not in the gallery or the viewing room. It was in the main boardroom on the 95th floor, a sterile expanse of glass and steel overlooking the city. Arthur Sterling sat at the head of the massive table. To his right sat Julian Vance, looking tan, rested, and radiating an aura of untouchable confidence. He gave Clara a dismissive smirk as she entered, the hired help arriving to give her little report. Two other senior board members, grim-faced men in their 70s, were also present. "Miss Rossi," Arthur began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You have had a week. Mr. Vance and the committee are confident in their recommendation. Please enlighten us." Clara took her place at the foot of the table. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady as she began. She started with the painting itself, methodically laying out the art-historical inconsistencies, the stylistic tics that were almost, but not quite, right. Julian leaned back in his chair, a bored expression on his face, occasionally shaking his head with a patronizing sigh. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling," he interjected, "this is amateur speculation. We hired the world's leading experts." "Experts you selected, Julian," Arthur cut in, his voice dangerously quiet. "Let her finish." Clara moved on to the provenance, projecting the Parisian sales ledgers next to the falsified documents. She showed them the ghost of Monsieur Dubois. Julian's smile tightened. He was no longer bored, he was irritated. Then she presented the chemical analysis. She put the spectral imaging data on the screen, a colorful graph of elemental peaks. "Modigliani died in 1920, she said, her voice clear and cold. "The rutile form of titanium white, detected here." She pointed with a laser, the red dot hovering over the damning spike, was not patented for commercial use until 1941. The room went silent. The two board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm. Julian's face had lost all its color. This is clearly a mistake in the lab work," he stammered. "It's a corn." The silence that fell after the boardroom doors clicked shut was of a different quality than the one that had preceded it. It was not the tense, anticipatory silence of a tribunal, but the profound, unnerving vacuum that follows an amputation. The air, once charged with Julian Vance's sputtering rage, was now thin and sterile, scrubbed clean of his presence. He had not just been fired. He had been unwritten. Clara stood at the foot of the long, polished table, her own reflection, a distant, blurry figure in its dark surface. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The adrenaline that had sharpened her voice to a blade and focused her mind to a single point was now receding, leaving in its wake a tremor that started in her hands and radiated inward. She had done it. She had faced the beast in its own lair and torn it down with nothing but facts. The feeling was not one of triumph. It was one of terrifying vertigo, as if she had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to see if she would fly or fall. The two board members, men who looked as if they had been carved from the same granite as the city's oldest banks, were staring at her. Their expressions were unreadable masks of shock and recalculation. They were not looking at a waitress anymore. They were looking at a weapon, and they were wondering who now held the trigger. Arthur Sterling remained standing at the head of the table. He did not look at Clara. His gaze was fixed on the empty chair where Julian had sat, his pale grey eyes holding a chillingly placid disgust. He was a king surveying a space where a traitor had just been executed. The act was done, the mess would be cleaned, the kingdom was secure. For a long moment, he seemed to have forgotten she was there. He was alone with his thoughts, and the landscape of that mind, Clara suspected, was a cold and lonely place. "The rot is deep," he said at last, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be directed at the city skyline beyond the glass wall. Eleanor, she trusted him. He was her nephew, her sister's son. The piece of information landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Julian Vance was not just an ambitious executive. He was family. This was not merely a corporate betrayal. It was a desecration. It explained the depth of Arthur's cold fury, the personal venom in his pronouncement of Julian as a forgery. He had not just tried to defraud the company. He had used the memory of the woman Arthur loved as his primary tool. Finally, Arthur's gaze shifted, moving down the length of the table to settle on her. The ice in his eyes had not melted, but it had changed. It was no longer the flat, dismissive ice of a frozen lake, but the faceted, complex ice of a diamond refracting light. He was seeing her, assessing her, not as an asset to be acquired, but as a force to be reckoned with. "You have done me a service, Miss Rossi," he stated. It was not a compliment, it was a statement of transaction. A significant one. "Name your price." The question hung in the air, blunt and transactional. The board members shifted, their interest piqued. This was a language they understood. Clara felt a surge of something hot and defiant in her chest. After everything, the fear, the pressure, the intellectual deep dive that had consumed her for a week, he was reducing it to a simple invoice. "My price?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "My price was the $10,000 you left at the restaurant. That settled our account. What I did today, that was not for sale." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed Arthur's face. He had expected her to ask for a bonus, a promotion, a golden parachute out of her life. He had not expected her to reject the premise of the transaction itself. "Then what was it for?" he pressed, taking a step toward her. "It was for the truth," Clara said simply. "It was for a woman I never met, who deserved to have her legacy protected from men like him. It was for a painting that never was, and for every beautiful, genuine thing they try to replace with a cheap copy." She took a breath, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. "And it was for me, to prove that everything I thought I had lost, my education, my passion, my eye, was still there. I owed that to myself. Arthur stopped, a few feet from her now. He studied her face, the faint shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He had thought he'd found a perfect instrument, a scalpel to excise a cancer. He was beginning to realize he had found something far more complex and perhaps far more dangerous. An idealist who could wield power with the precision of a cynic. "Idealism is an expensive commodity, Miss Rossi," he said, his voice softer now. "It rarely survives contact with this world." "Perhaps it just needs a better defender," she countered. A long silence stretched between them. The two board members exchanged a look and, with a quiet scrape of chairs, rose and left the room, recognizing the conversation had become a private negotiation, far exceeding their remit. The door clicked shut again, leaving just the two of them suspended, 95 floors above the city. "The Sterling Foundation needs a new director," Arthur said, the words less an offer than a logical conclusion. "It needs to be purged. Every acquisition, every grant, every partnership must be re-examined through a lens of absolute authenticity. The work will be a descent into a labyrinth of half-truths, polite deceptions, and outright fraud. It will be thankless. You will make enemies of powerful people. You will be isolated. And you will be given the full, unequivocal power of my name and my resources to see it done." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I am not offering you a job. I am offering you a war against the inauthentic. Are you prepared to fight it?" Clara's mind reeled. The scale of it was terrifying. He was not asking her to be an administrator. He was asking her to be an inquisitor. She thought of her tiny apartment, of the smell of stale cooking oil and the constant hum of the ancient refrigerator. She thought of the 16-hour days on her feet, the carefully constructed mask of serene competence she wore for patrons who looked right through her. She had been living a ghost life, a pale imitation of the one she was meant for. Here, in this sterile room of terrifying power, she felt more real, more herself, than she had in years. "Yes," she said. The single word was quiet, but it resonated in the vast room with the finality of a gavel strike. "But I have conditions," she added, her voice gaining strength. Arthur raised a single silver eyebrow. "First," she said, "my title will not be director. It will be Chief Integrity Officer. My role is not just to acquire art, but to guarantee the truth of everything the Foundation touches. Second, I will build my own team from the ground up. I will not be inheriting Julian's staff of sycophants. I will hire investigators, researchers, historians, people who value evidence over reputation. Third, my findings, all of them, will be reported directly and only to you. There will be no committees, no boards, no filters." She took a final, deep breath, staking everything on this last demand. "And fourth, the Foundation will establish a new endowment, the Eleanor Vance Grant, dedicated to identifying and funding brilliant individuals whose talents are trapped by their circumstances. Scholars, artists, scientists, people like me, who need someone to see them for what they are, not the job they're forced to do. It will be a perpetual search for the genuine article. That will be her true legacy." Arthur Sterling was utterly still. She had not just accepted his war, she had dictated the terms of surrender and outlined the entire campaign. She had seen the structural weaknesses in his organization and in his own life's work and proposed a radical, systemic solution. She was not asking for power. She was defining it. A slow smile, so faint it was barely a curve of his lips, touched his face. It was the first genuine, unguarded expression she had ever seen from him. It was a look of profound, unadulterated respect. "Welcome to Sterling Holdings, Ms. Rossi," he said. The first year was an exercise in silent, brutal efficiency. Clara's office on the 90th floor was Spartan, containing little more than a large desk, a powerful computer, and shelves that quickly filled with forensic analyses and archival binders. She became a phantom in the tower, a quiet, relentless presence. The whispers followed her down the hallways. The waitress, the boss's pet project. She ignored them. She was not there to win a popularity contest. She was there to clean the house. Her team was, as promised, unconventional. She hired a disgraced financial journalist, known for his obsessive deep dives into offshore accounts. She brought on a retired art detective from Interpol, a man with a weary face and eyes that had seen the very best of art and the very worst of humanity. Her core researcher was a young woman with severe social anxiety who possessed an almost supernatural ability to find connections in disparate data. A digital bloodhound who was happiest lost in the catacombs of the internet. They were her collection of odd, brilliant, authentic tools, and they were fiercely loyal. Together, they began the Great Purge. They worked backward through Julian's tenure, unearthing a sickening web of cronyism, kickbacks, and fraud. A grant for an inner-city arts program had been funneled to a shell corporation owned by a board member's son. A priceless artifact donated to a museum was a clever replica, the original having been sold on the black market. Each discovery was a quiet, precise strike. Clara would compile the evidence into a slim, undeniable report, place it on Arthur's desk, and within days, another powerful figure would quietly resign, another partnership would be dissolved. The work was isolating. She lived and breathed the foundation, her old life fading into a distant memory. She moved her parents to a comfortable home in the countryside, the weight of their debt lifted so completely it felt like a dream. But she saw them less and less. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of the 90th floor, to the silent communion with Arthur Sterling. Their relationship was unlike any she had ever known. It was devoid of pleasantries, built on a foundation of shared purpose and brutal honesty. They would meet late at night in his private gallery, the city lights a silent, glittering audience below. He would listen, his posture unnervingly still as she detailed her latest findings. He never questioned her methods, only her conclusions, pushing her to make her arguments airtight, to eliminate every possibility of error. In these late-night sessions, she learned more about him. She saw the ghost of Eleanor in the pieces he chose to keep, the ones he would stand before for long stretches of silence. He spoke of his wife not with sadness, but with a kind of intellectual reverence, as if she were a complex theorem he was still trying to solve. She saw the world as a text, filled with hidden meanings, he told her one night, standing before a turbulent Turner seascape. She believed that beauty was the language truth used to speak to us. The forgeries. It wasn't the financial loss that broke her. It was the violation of that language. It was like learning the person you love most had been speaking to you in lies your entire life. Clara began to understand that her mission was not just about protecting a legacy. It was about trying to restore a man's faith in the very language of his life. Her greatest test came not from a forgery, but from a genuine masterpiece. It was a small, haunting painting by Frida Kahlo, a self-portrait she had gifted to a lover. The provenance was perfect. The science was irrefutable. It was real. But her research into its history uncovered a dark and painful story. During a period of political upheaval in Mexico, it had been stolen from the lover's family by a brutal political operative. That operative's son, now an elderly, philanthropic man who had spent his life atoning for his father's sins, had unknowingly inherited it and was now offering to donate it to the Sterling Foundation, believing it would be the crowning achievement of his life's penance. Meanwhile, Clara's team had located the legitimate heirs of the original owner, a family of teachers in Oaxaca, living in modest circumstances, who knew of the painting only as a whispered family legend of a great treasure lost to violence. The corporate play was simple: accept the donation. It was legal, the statute of limitations on the theft having long since passed. It would be a major coup for the foundation. But Clara knew it was a lie. It would be acquiring a true painting built on a false history. She took the problem to Arthur. She laid out the two paths. "We can accept the painting," she said, her voice even. "It will be a celebrated addition to the collection. Or we can facilitate its return to the family in Oaxaca. We will gain nothing, and we will make an enemy of a powerful donor." Arthur looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she saw the vulture of Wall Street in his eyes, the man who had built an empire on ruthless, logical acquisition. The old Arthur would have taken the painting without a second thought. "What does integrity demand?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "It demands we return the painting," she said without hesitation. "The truth of the object is tied to the truth of its story. You cannot have one without the other." He nodded slowly. "Then do it, and document the donor's family history. I have a feeling our M&A division might find it useful to know exactly where all his other assets came from." It was in that moment that Clara saw the synthesis. He had not abandoned his ruthless nature. He had simply placed it in service of her idealistic one. He would return the painting because it was the right thing to do, and he would use the information to destroy a business rival, because that was who he was. The combination was more powerful than either impulse alone. The return of the Carlo painting was not a major news story. It was a quiet act of restorative justice, a footnote in the art world. But on the 90th floor, it was a seismic event. It was the moment the department of authenticity became the defining principle of the entire foundation. 2 years after she had walked into the boardroom, Clara stood with Arthur in the main gallery. It had been transformed. Many of the famous, flashy pieces were gone. In their place were works of quieter, more profound power. The collection was smaller, but it was flawless. It was true. On a central wall, in a place of honor, hung the Modigliani forgery. Arthur had insisted on keeping it. "Why?" Clara had asked him once. "As a reminder," he had said. "A reminder that the most dangerous lies are the ones that look most like the truth. And a reminder of the day my foundation acquired its most valuable asset." That evening, he led her to a small, private alcove she had never seen before. Inside, on a simple easel, was a portrait. It was of a woman with intelligent, vibrant eyes, and a smile that seemed to be sharing a delightful secret. It was Eleanor Sterling, but the style was unfamiliar, raw, and deeply emotional. "I painted this," Arthur said, his voice quiet, "in the first year after we were married. Before all of this." He swept a hand toward the window, at the empire of glass and steel. "It is perhaps the only truly authentic thing I have ever created." Clara looked from the painting to the man standing beside her. She saw the layers stripped away, the titan, the shark, the widower, and saw the core of the man, the one who had once known how to create something true and had spent a lifetime burying that knowledge under the weight of acquisitions. "It's a masterpiece," she whispered, and she meant it. He looked out at the city, no longer seeing a balance sheet of assets and liabilities, but a sprawling, complex canvas of stories, some true, some false, He had spent his life as a collector of things, only to find that the one thing worth possessing was a quality, a way of seeing. He had sought a tool to fix his wife's broken legacy, and in the process had been given the chance to build a new one of his own, one founded not on power, but on truth. The waitress from Aria had not saved him. She had done something far more difficult. She had forced him to see himself with the same clear, unforgiving, and ultimately compassionate honesty with which she saw the world. And in that shared, quiet space, surrounded by true things, they were no longer an employer and an employee. They were partners, guardians of the fragile, essential boundary between what was real and what was merely a beautiful, expensive lie. The work was not over. It would never be over. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Sterling was not bored.